Lord of the Mysteries audiobook by Kevin 301, Awakening Meow. The black cat's cry echoed in the open area that was surrounded by the secluded forest. Regardless of whether it was the adult black-robed man or the 15 or 16-year-old boys and girls, all of them simultaneously cast their gaze onto the corpse lying in the middle. A gust of cold wind blew, and the black cat landed on the ground, staring at the human who had just thrown it. It kept flicking its tail around. All of a sudden, its fur stood on end again. Then, exerting great force with its hind limbs, it jumped up and fled in another direction. Unfortunately, whatever it did had failed to attract any attention. All the humans present had their attention focused on the motionless corpse. Seconds turned to minutes, but the corpse didn't undergo any anticipated changes. Another failure. One of the teenagers moved closer and crouched down, poking at the dead man's skin with his fingers. There's no reaction. He turned around halfway and spoke to the man in black and his companions. At this moment, he felt a gust of wind hit his face from beneath him. With a swoosh, the corpse sat up. The youth was startled and immediately cheered in surprise. "It's a success! It's a success!" Before he could finish his sentence, the corpse grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him into its arms. Then it opened its mouth and bit down, producing a sound and causing blood to splatter. "Ah, help!" The youth screamed in horror and retreated with all his might, but he couldn't break free. The corpse raised its head, revealing rows of white teeth, as well as bits of flesh hanging between its teeth and blood flowing from its mouth. The black-robed man was stunned for a moment. Then he took out a whistle that was brass in color. He put it in his mouth and blew on it. Then he said in Hermes, "I command you in the name of death." As his voice echoed in the air, the corpse stopped chewing and momentarily froze on the spot. The youth, whose neck and shoulders had been mangled by the bite, similarly collapsed as if he had lost his soul. The dirt around his nether regions was completely moist. "It really is possible," the black-robed man muttered in pleasant surprise. He pointed at the corpse and once again said in Hermes, "Get up." The corpse abruptly stood up. Then it threw back its shoulders before quickly running into the depths of the secluded forest. "Come back." The black-robed man cried out in surprise, but the corpse showed no signs of stopping. He blew his whistle again and shouted with dignity, "I command you to return in the name of death." With those words, the corpse disappeared into the woods. "I ordered you to return." The black-robed man stood rooted to the spot in stupefaction, as he mumbled to himself in a daze. In the woods, Klein held Isaac's copper whistle and the matchbox in one hand. He kept lighting matchsticks and shook his wrist to extinguish them before throwing them to the ground. During this process, he moved backwards in an arc. Tap, tap, tap. A corpse with a pale face and a foul stench rushed over. Its lifeless eyes stared straight at the ancient and exquisite copper whistle. As Klein retreated, his cheeks puffed out, he aimed at the corpse and simulated the sound. Bang! The corpse suddenly staggered as a penetrating wound appeared in its chest. Bang! Klein puffed out his cheeks again and fired another air bullet. Splat! The head of the corpse shattered as rotten liquid dripped from it incessantly. However, that wasn't a fatal injury to the corpse. It only slowed down for a moment before it continued again. Upon seeing this, Klein took a step back and snapped loudly. "Pa!" A bright flame rose from the ground, enveloping the corpse and igniting its outer garments. Tap, tap, tap. The corpse rushed through the flames and continued to charge forward like a mad bull. Pa, pa, pa. Klein kept snapping his fingers, causing red flames to appear on the ground, one after another. The corpse didn't feel any pain as it passed through the flames, but gradually its body began to burn, and the flames grew more and more intense. It gave off the strange feeling as though a candle was melting. Finally, the corpse, which had turned into a torch, arrived in front of Klein as it clawed at him. At the same time, a flame rose up and engulfed both him and Klein. The corpse grabbed Klein's shoulder but only produced sparks. Klein's figure dissipated in the red light and reappeared in the farthest burning pile. At that point, The corpse seemed to have exhausted all of its strength and stopped struggling. It quickly melted under the dark green flames, turning into ashes and oil wax. He's stronger than all the zombies and wraiths that I've met before. Well, not as good as Mr. Azek's descendant. If it weren't for me, they would all be dead here today. Klein shook his head and walked through the trees toward the open area. At this moment, the black-robed man had already noticed the changes in the forest. Without any hesitation, he turned around and ran, while the 7 to 8 youngsters scattered in a flash. However, when they realized that they were the only ones in the area, they timidly stopped and returned to the original area where they gathered together. Having just experienced the awakening of a corpse, and how the corpse had bitten one of the youths, they didn't dare to run away, alone, in the deep, dark night. It would make the back of their necks feel cold. They looked at each other. No one dared to help the youth who was badly mutilated in the neck and shoulders, afraid that he might turn into a zombie at any moment. In the short silence that made their hearts beat like a drum, they saw a clown, wearing flashy clothes with red, yellow, and white paint covering his face, walking out from the forest. This was an illusion that was personally created by Klein. He surveyed his surroundings but didn't pursue the black-robed man. Instead, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Who was the one who presided over the ceremony? Who?" It seemed as if the teenagers were still in a daze. It took them a few seconds before they pushed out a trembling boy who replied, He's our language teacher in ancient Fasak, Kapusky Reed. He claimed to have a deep understanding of death and wanted to lead us in the search of the mysteries of immortality. So he's a teacher from school, the mysteries of immortality. You really don't need to pay taxes to brag, judging from his performance just now. This fellow shouldn't be a spirit medium. At the very most, he would be a gravedigger. In fact, he might only be at Sequence 9, a corpse collector of course. He might not be from the death pathway and simply joined the numinous episcopate because of his adoration. After Klein got the exact location where Kapusky stayed, he thought for a moment and said, "You guys can go back now. Don't get involved in this anymore. Don't leak this out. Otherwise, all of you will die." Then he emphasized again, "All of you will die." The young boys and girls who had been scared witless by what had just happened all frantically nodded. They prepared to leave with each other's help. At this moment, a young girl with smooth hair pointed at her companion who was moaning in pain on the ground and asked, Will he be all right? He won't die for now, but you have to take him to a doctor. Say that he was bitten by a hyena that often eats rotting meat." Klein ignored them and headed back into the woods. The young man and woman looked at each other and someone blurted out, "Excuse me, may I ask how we should address you?" Klein smiled and deliberately misled him as he replied in a low voice, "I'm just a gatekeeper of hell." As he spoke, a mist spread out and his figure disappeared from where he stood. Of course, those were all illusions. A gatekeeper of hell. The young men and women repeated the words softly, each having their own thoughts. However, after a gust of bone-piercing cold wind blew past, they trembled once more, supported their companions, and left the place without daring to look back. This is a member of the numinous episcopate. What a disappointment. If he didn't abandon his current identity, I would pay him a visit in the middle of the night to see if he knows anything. Yeah, I have to teach him a lesson so that he wouldn't dare to bring trouble to the students again. Does he think spirit dances and resurrection rituals are child's play? Klein habitually judged the situation from a Nighthawk's standpoint. Soon, he returned to Rogo Kalaman's mansion and waited patiently for the bodyguards to pass by during their patrols. As soon as he found an opportunity, he climbed over the fence and quickly followed the shadows to the house. Then he quietly climbed up to the balcony. At that moment, the figurine disguised as him was still smoking. "Pa!" Klein snapped his fingers. The figure in front of him turned into a thin piece of paper and floated onto his palm. Compared to before, this piece of paper was covered with red, rusty marks and was no longer usable. Klein didn't dare to throw it anywhere. He folded it and placed it in his pocket. Having done all this, he sauntered back down the hall and into Adol's bedroom. "What took you so long?" Stuart asked in a trembling voice. He had gone to the door to inquire, and he had found Sherlock Moriarty smoking one cigarette after another. Due to his duty, he didn't dare leave the bedroom. Klein laughed and replied, "Take a rest and relax. You can go too, I don't mind." Just as Stuart was about to agree, he suddenly thought of something. He would end up being the only person on the balcony, surrounded by the dark night and without sufficient brightness. There would be a cold wind and an environment that always reminded one of a ghost story. Therefore, he forced a smile and said, "It's fine, I don't need it." Klein smiled silently and sat down again, letting the reclining chair rock gently and slowly in the night. This continued till daybreak. Nothing else happened. When Adol woke up, he sat up in bed, lost in thought. Klein didn't say anything, but he swapped places with Kaslana and her assistant and slowly walked to the guest room to catch up on his sleep. He was asleep when he heard Rogo Kalaman exclaim in pleasant surprise, "Oh, my boy, you're fine now. Holy Lord of Storms, I'll donate £300 to the church." "Why, you are telling me that they won't kill you. It was all a misunderstanding. £300. How extravagant." Klein rolled over and wrapped his arms around the soft, warm quilt while mumbling. Then he went back to sleep. At noon, when Klein went downstairs to have a meal, Kaslana sat opposite him and asked with a slight frown, "What happened last night?" "Nothing," Klein answered simply, and then he laughed. "Does Adol waking up and going to the washroom count?" Next to him, Stuart slowed down his actions and nodded in agreement. She glanced at their faces, then she retracted her gaze and replied in a low voice, "No." The corner of Klein's mouth curled up as he skillfully cut his steak. 302, a clue the detective, who had been on leave, returned to Grim Garden Street shortly after Klein and the others had finished their lunch. This also meant that his assignment was over. Due to the visible improvement in Adol's situation, Rogo Kalaman was quite generous in the settlement of his pay, and he paid an additional 50% above the £10 which they had agreed upon, as expected of a jewelry businessman to be this generous. However, compared to the other people in West Borough and Empress Borough, he isn't considered that rich. Grim Garden Street is close to the suburbs, and it's not too far from the cemetery. I can reach it in 10 minutes if I run at full speed. Miss Bodyguard, no Miss Sharon, is highly likely of being a Sequence 5 Beyonder. She charges £1,000 for 3 days, while I, as a Sequence 7 Beyonder, am only worth £15 a day. There's still a big difference, of course. If I were to take on such missions every day, my income would be over £5,400 a year, putting me at the top of the middle class. Even the top manager of the Backland Bank makes £5,000 a year. This is just pure fantasy. For most detectives, business comes sporadically, and the amount of Beyonder ingredients I need to advance to Sequence 6 is definitely more than £3,000. Just thinking about it makes my head hurt. For normal people, this is a huge sum of money, enough to sustain a good life. The good news is that even if I grasp the acting method, digesting the Sequence 7 potion will take me somewhere between 6 months to 3 years. Even if I can quickly conclude the rules of a magician, I'll only be able to push forward that lowest threshold by 1 to 2 months. I still have plenty of time to save up and search for clues to these ingredients. Wait. Miss Justice still owes me. My adorer £5,000, however. Her financial situation isn't in good shape recently. It will be difficult for her to come up with a large sum of cash in the next few months. Klein took the 3 £5 notes and left West Borough with thoughts running through his mind. After returning to Minsk Street, he quickly burned the used paper figurine and made another 2 more. In the evening, he took the steam metro to the Backlund Bridge district, and according to the numbers provided in the newspapers, he knocked on the door of the house where the gathering would take place. Similar to the past few times, he put on an iron mask that covered only the upper half of his face, wore a hooded black robe, and followed the attendant into the activity room, where only one candle burned quietly. At first glance, Klein noticed that the number of Beyonders present at this gathering was less than half of what it used to be. I came at the exact time. Are the others late? This time, Klein didn't change his gait and picked a corner before sitting down slowly. After a few minutes, the old eye of wisdom cleared his throat and said, "Let's begin the gathering. The others shouldn't be coming." After saying that, he gave a brief explanation. As the serial killer has yet to be found, the Night Hawks, mandated punishers, and the machinery hive mind, as well as a large number of Me-9 Beyonders, are outdoing large-scale investigations and searches. Under such a situation, it's very normal and understandable for those friends to be unwilling to go out and participate in gatherings. Frankly, I'm surprised by the number of people that showed up today. Sure enough, a circle of Beyonders isn't isolated. They would also be affected by current affairs. Klein looked around and saw that the fat apothecary wasn't absent. His heart immediately relaxed. The apothecary nudged the metal mask on his face, calling out without much hope, seeking to purchase the spring of elves' marrow crystals. Price is negotiable. I have it, Klein said without hesitation. He was worried that someone else might have found this Beyonder ingredient, thereby causing the price of his stock of goods to fall. Although Beyonder ingredients were rare, and it was rare for items to reappear in independent circles, one could never be too careful. Seeking to purchase the spring of elves' marrow crystals, the apothecary didn't seem to hear the response. He was halfway through the sentence when it suddenly struck him. He turned his head to look at Klein and blurted, "You do?" "Yes." Klein found his fiery gaze a little too overwhelming. As he did so, he rolled up his black robe and took out an iron cigarette case. Pa! Klein opened the cigarette case, revealing the faded, egg-shaped spring of elves' marrow crystal. "If you're worried, you can let the old Mr. Eye of Wisdom appraise it," Klein added in a low voice. This wasn't really necessary because it was obvious if something was a Beyonder ingredient or not. It was also quickly identified if something was contaminated or not. However, if one was lacking in mysticism knowledge, a Beyonder ingredient could very easily be mixed up with similar-looking ingredients. When that happened, one needed an appraisal. The apothecary looked like he was looking at a beautiful lady he had been yearning for all this time. He looked at the Beyonder ingredient in Klein's hands, mesmerized. After a few seconds, he shook his head and said, "No, there's no need. That's it. That's it." Klein curved the corner of his lips into a smile and named his price. £300 and clues to the apothecary formula. Clues to the apothecary formula. It's you. The apothecary was stunned for a moment before he finally understood who the man was. It was the guy who made him bring the sedative for nothing. Soon after, his heart pained, his regret similarly reaching its limit as he sighed emotionally. "You really are a lucky guy. Why didn't I choose that road of fortune? I'm the king of yellow and black who wields good luck after all." Klein lampooned himself. The apothecary sighed and changed his posture. "That's too expensive. £200 and a clue to the formula." "The clue to the formula is only a bonus because I cannot confirm its veracity. Therefore, £300, not a penny less. I believe it's needed elsewhere." Klein smiled. "This price is actually very fair. If it were anyone else, they might have offered £400 or even £500, and you might have even accepted that price. I'm not that foolish. I can still wait." The apothecary grumbled before saying, The clue can be verified by old man, old Mr. Eye of Wisdom. It must be something that exists objectively, something that has detailed information before I'm able to appraise it. Just a clue isn't among these conditions, Eye of Wisdom said. Divination, on the other hand, can roughly determine whether the clue is effective as long as it doesn't involve powers 2 or 3 sequences above myself, Klein silently said to himself. However, he wouldn't reveal his expertise in divination at a Beyonder gathering. All right then, 300 pounds plus the clue. You lucked out. The apothecary took a deep breath and pulled out a thick wad of cash. He then counted the corresponding amount and then asked the attendant to bring him a pen and paper before he started writing. After he was done writing the clue, he crumpled the paper into a ball and handed it along with the cash and some items to the attendant. Klein was suddenly stunned when he saw the attendant walk over. In addition to the cash and clue, there were also 4 glass tubes filled with what seemed to be pure liquids. "What are these?" Klein asked, perplexed. "Have you forgot? Your sedative, the sedative I specially concocted. It's 10 solely a bottle, 2 pounds for 4, so the cash there is 298 pounds, answered the apothecary. "If you're worried about my sedative, you can have it appraised." "I really forgot. I did all of that to gain Miss Sharon's trust, and now that she's not here, well, it's fine. Maybe a sedative would be able to handle some unexpected situations." Klein stopped talking, took out the spring of Elves Marrow crystal, took the items, counted the cash in front of everyone, and determined their authenticity with the faint candlelight. "A total of 298 pounds, that's right." Seeing that his wallet could no longer hold any more cash, Klein could only roll up the bills and slip them into his pocket. After putting away the sedative, he unfolded the note and glanced at the clue. "On the south side of the bridge on Rose Street at the Harvest Church, find Bishop Otravsky. As long as you help him complete a mission, you'll be able to get the apothecary formula." Harvest Church. That's one of the few cathedrals of the Church of Mother Earth in the kingdom. This church also grasps 2 Beyonder pathways, planter and apothecary. The clues match well, Klein thought as he refolded the note. As the gathering continued, it was unknown whether the female Beyonder with the artisan backing her wasn't present, or she just didn't have any new Beyonder weapons to sell. There were no signs of her, leaving Klein disappointed. Now that he had 509 pounds in hand, he wanted to equip himself nicely. After many transactions were aborted, a man sitting on a stool said in a low voice, "A friend of mine was unfortunately discovered in this investigation. He's imprisoned in a particular Lord of Storm's cathedral by the mandated punishers. I wish to hire a few helpers to rescue him." Eye of Wisdom immediately replied, "Stray dog, give up that thought. A cathedral's mandated punishers and sealed artifacts are enough to destroy all of us here. Your friend's fate has already been decided. Don't let yourself be trapped in the same situation." Stray Dog looked around and realized that no one responded to his request. He couldn't help but thump his thigh, growling, "But what did he do wrong? He's an excellent physician. He saved a lot of patients and has never hurt anyone. Just because he consumed a potion and became a Beyonder, he's to be imprisoned in a place where the sun never shines. He'll even become an experimental subject for the mandated punishers." "Why? Why?" Stray Dog's agonized questions echoed in the room. Even the apothecary, who couldn't keep his mouth shut, remained silent. Klein, a former official Beyonder, could only sigh deeply in his heart. Without the spread of the acting method, wild Beyonders are ticking time bombs. But if the acting method is popularized, then the situation would become even more chaotic and bloody. After all, there are the laws of Beyonder characteristics, indestructibility and conservation. In this heavy atmosphere, the gathering came to an end. Klein, who had got nothing else, spoke again. "Who has revolvers and bullets that come augmented with different Beyonder effects? For example, purification, demon hunting, etc. He didn't specifically fix the caliber of the bullets because he didn't have a gun yet. He could simply wait until he bought the bullets before matching the corresponding gun. In the midst of the silence, a female Beyonder sitting in the same corner replied in a low voice, "I can help you ask, and I'll give you the answer at the next gathering." It seemed to be the lady with the artisan backing her. Klein sighed. All right. After the gathering ended, he didn't return to Minsk Street directly. Instead, he went to East Borough and changed his clothes, heading to the border between North Borough and Hillston Borough. It was where the suspected member of the numinous episcopate, Kapusky Reed, lived. 303 Rookie North Borough, Oka Street. Kapusky Reed was sitting in a reclining chair in his activity room, lost in thought. In front of him was a fireplace burning with charcoal. As a senior educator at a public school, he received a salary of more than £4 a week, which was enough for a bachelor like him to live quite well. But the clothes he wore at home were patched up, and the teacups on the table looked extremely simple. Without taking off his wig, the most striking thing about Kapusky was his high cheekbones and puffed-up chest, a deformity in which the sternum protruded outwards. On his knee was a book of poems in ancient Fasak, but he hadn't flipped a single page even after some time had passed. Kapusky's eyes were unfocused as he stared blankly when he suddenly heard a light chuckle in his ear. "I'm very curious as to why you didn't run and chose to remain at home. Aren't you afraid of the police coming for you?" The voice was low and hoarse, like a boy whose voice was cracking during puberty. Kapusky shuddered and almost jumped out of his reclining chair. He abruptly turned his head to look and saw that there was a figure sitting on the sofa a few steps away from him. The figure wore summer wear, a linen shirt and light trousers. Its face was hazy and indistinct. Who are you? What are you doing here?" Kapusky asked immediately as he gripped the armrest. Klein, who had used his hallucination powers, leaned back, crossed his hands, and leisurely said, "Just last night, it should be earlier this morning, I saved all of you." "Saved us." Kapusky relaxed a little when he realized that the intruder didn't seem to mean any harm. "Why, you're that person in the forest. You took care of the corpse we awakened." As he spoke, he moved awkwardly, showing obvious fear. "He was able to infiltrate without me realizing it while I was awake. I definitely wouldn't be able to resist." Such thoughts quickly flashed through Kapusky's mind. "You guys are quite lucky that I happened to pass by. Otherwise, there would only be corpses left strewn on the ground in the forest, corpses that would have been bitten to shreds." Klein laughed. "Answer my previous question. I'm very curious why you stayed at home. Do you know what crimes you've committed?" From the way that he had conducted the resurrection ritual, and the reaction he had before and after the ritual, Klein had confirmed that Kapusky was a rookie who didn't have the means to hide his true emotions. Therefore, he intended to only use spirit vision and interrogation to get to the bottom of the matter. At most, he would verify it with divination at the end. I know, secretly buying corpses and robbing corpses from tombs. These are all crimes that can land me in jail for more than 10 years. Moreover, I'll definitely be punished by the church." Kapusky, who didn't look 30, drew a breath and said with a wry smile, "However, as long as I didn't cause too much trouble, those children and their parents wouldn't snitch on me because they also did the same thing. Even if they wanted to get a lighter sentence by helping the investigation by turning themselves in, they would still end up in jail for some time." Kapusky gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Some of the children have already told their parents who I am. They've gotten gangsters to warn me to resign within a week and stay away from school." I agreed. Klein gently nodded his head. "It's a good thing to change environments. Of course, don't do similar things again. Bewitching ignorant children to commit crimes is a heinous act." "I won't, never again. I never imagined that it would be that dangerous. I just saw that they had the same interests as I did, which was why I wanted to teach them and lead them to search for the secrets of immortality. As for digging graves, many doctors did it a long time ago. Kapusky sighed with some lingering fear. The color of his emotions matches his current state of mind. From the sound of it, he doesn't seem to be a member of the numinous episcopate. Klein thought for a moment. Then he bluntly asked, "Where did you learn the spirit dance from?" "Spirit dance? Ah, I usually call it the dance of death." Kapusky was taken aback at first before he came to a realization. "An old gentleman taught it to me." "An old gentleman," Klein pressed. Kapusky's mind turned adrift as he recalled his memories. "He was a vagabond. He fainted in front of my house because of a serious illness. At the time, I didn't know that he was ill. I thought he had simply fallen unconscious, so I helped him home. I gave him a heated towel and applied some ointment for him. After he woke up, he told me not to send him to a hospital or clinic and that death was not the end. I experienced the deaths of my parents and several relatives and was very interested in such things. So, I chatted with him and found out that he had profound knowledge and an admirable philosophy in this area. He seemed to be very satisfied with my curiosity and even performed a miracle of killing a mosquito and waking it up. This introduction, I've read at least 10 novels with similar openings in my previous life. They were all novels about bringing an old grandpa who was on the brink of death home out of kindness, only to have a fortuitous encounter. Klein's mouth twitched. "So you left him at home?" Kapusky nodded solemnly and said, "Yes. If it wasn't for the lack of time, I would have even wanted to become his student. During those few days, he taught me a lot of knowledge and the dance of death. Unfortunately, this period of time was too brief. As soon as I built momentum, he died, leaving behind only a copper whistle." Before he finished his sentence, Kapusky took out an exquisite copper whistle that didn't seem old. "This is it." "I have one too. It's probably at the ancestor grade, though," Klein lampooned, and he thoughtfully asked, "How long ago was this? What did he look like? Where did you bury him?" "Half a year ago. His most obvious feature was his graying hair and red spots on the side of his face. He told me to bury him in the garden out back." Kapusky did a calculation of the dates. "It's not Mr. Azek, but the chances are that he's a member of the numinous episcopate and not someone of a low sequence." Klein changed the subject and asked, "Apart from the spirit dance, you also learned the resurrection ritual?" "I've only learned half of that ritual. I used some scattered knowledge and folklore to slowly improve it bit by bit," Kapusky answered very honestly. "Improved it based on folklore. Oh, that poor black cat, may the goddess bless you." Klein resisted the urge to draw a crimson moon on his chest. "What else?" he pressed. "Yes, and this copper whistle. I think it's the key to communicating with the world beyond our senses." Kapusky raised it and blew at it, sighing. "Every time I finish blowing it, I can feel the surroundings turn cold. It's as if someone is watching me and tugging at me." While he was speaking, Klein, who had his spirit vision activated, saw water patterns ripple out from the ground. A cold air spread out alongside it, and the fire and light dimmed a little. Next, a skull with 3 protruding, unfocused eyes emerged from the ground. Around the skull there were many black jointed tentacles. A tentacle reached out, touching Kapusky's leg and tugged at his clothes from time to time, appearing rather impatient. However, Kapusky didn't respond at all, as though he hadn't noticed. "Is this a messenger? The copper whistle is used to summon their corresponding messengers. What's the meaning of you summoning it without giving it a letter?" Klein was stunned seeing this scene. At that moment, Kapusky looked at him excitedly. "Did you feel it? The surroundings turned cold. The gas lamps have dimmed too. I'm not lying. Someone is watching me and tugging at me." The horrific-looking messenger tried to touch Kapusky over and over again, but in the end, it didn't receive a letter and went back underground in resignation. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched slightly as he saw this scene. He whispered to himself in his heart, I take back what I said about him. He's not a rookie, he's an utter noob. He's not even a beyonder. I had thought that he was someone who had just stepped through the door of mysticism to learn the basics. But now, it seems like he hasn't even found the location of the door. Corpse collectors of the death sequence pathway can all see ghosts and spirit bodies directly. Combined with how Kapusky had acted by using the copper whistle to command the zombie after the ritual, Klein was convinced that he wasn't lying. He sighed silently. Then he thought of a question. If I were to write a note and hand it to that messenger, where would it be delivered? A true member of the numinous episcopate, some senior member. Suppressing this thought, Klein nodded and said, "It has indeed turned cold." After replying, he quickly changed the topic. "Have you felt anything unusual since the old gentleman's death?" Not before, but in the last 2 weeks, I'd have the occasional feeling that someone around me is like a corpse, the kind that can be awoken." Kapusky asked, feeling both curious and afraid, "Is it a hallucination?" "It's in line with what Adol said." "He isn't lying." Klein stole a glance at the colors of Kapusky's aura and sincerely told him, "I suggest that you go to a cathedral at least 3 times a week for the next 2 months, attend Mass, and listen to preachings. If you do not wish to do so, you can first prepare a grave for yourself." "All right," Kapusky answered, feeling disappointed. He thought that it was a manifestation of his improvement. Klein contemplated for a moment and said in a commanding tone, "Take me to the old gentleman's corpse." "Ah, okay." Kapusky was about to refuse, but then he instantly recognized the reality of the situation he was in. He picked up his tools and led Klein out the back door from the kitchen into a withered garden and stopped in front of a slanted tree. Klein stood by his side and watched Kapusky skillfully dig through the dirt, revealing the slate underneath. Having finished with the upper layer, Kapusky used his tools to pry open the slate. Oof! The slate was pressed against the soil that had been dug out just moments ago. The not-so-deep tomb was veiled in the crimson moon's luster that faintly penetrated through the clouds. Kapusky subconsciously looked over when he suddenly let out a miserable scream, retreated a few steps, and fell to the ground. There was no rotting corpse or bones in the tomb. The bottom layer was littered with white feathers, dyed in yellow oil. 304 feathers, white feathers. Looking at the corpseless grave, Klein suddenly thought of a word: angel. In the canon of the 7 major churches, they were filled with legends of angels and saints. The former had one characteristic: a pair of pure white wings on its back, and as many as 2, 3, or even 6 pairs of pure white wings. However, in the blink of an eye, Klein remembered something else. Mr. Azek had once described his dream to him, one that seemed to indicate his different lives. One of the scenes was inside a dark mausoleum. There were many opened ancient coffins beside him, and in the coffins there were corpses with white feathers growing from their backs. Is this a special characteristic of the death pathway, or a strange phenomenon caused by the numinous episcopate? Klein didn't say a word as he restrained his emotions and calmly looked at the white feathers stained with yellowish oil at the bottom of the grave. His initial judgment was that the old gentleman wasn't an angel, as the terrifying sequence 2, or even sequence 1 beyonders, would certainly produce intense effects on their surroundings when they died. For example, the holy artifact, the ashes of a saint which had been stored behind Tinjin City's Chinese gate, would extend almost invisible thin, black, and cold lines so as to seal the people and things around it. Of course, it's also possible that he didn't actually die. He's like Mr. Azek. Klein bent down and picked up 3 white feathers with his black-gloved right hand. He planned to do some divination above the gray fog when he returned home. At that moment, Kapusky came to his senses, scrambled to Klein's side, and looked at the grave with a hint of fear. "Where's the body?" Klein looked at him and said in a low voice, "Maybe he left by himself." "He left by himself," Kapusky repeated in horror, now fully aware of how terrible it was for the dead to awaken. His legs trembled as he muttered to himself, But I didn't use the resurrection ritual on him." Klein turned around and looked at him for a few seconds. "Death is not the end. Death is not the end. Death is not the end." Kapusky was quite frightened by his own beliefs as he blurted out, Will he come back?" Well, the copper whistle had summoned a messenger which probably corresponds to the old gentleman. In other words, by giving the messenger a letter, it is equivalent to sending a letter to the old gentleman, a man who has been dead for almost half a year. I wonder where he went and what kind of state he's in." In response to Kapusky's question, Klein gave him an indifferent reminder. "Don't blow that copper whistle again." "You mean the copper whistle will draw him back?" Kapusky asked in horror. Before Klein could reply, he asked again, "Can you help me throw this copper whistle into the Tussock River? If you can't, I'll do it myself." "Weren't you interested in the philosophy of death?" Klein lampooned as he reached out to take Kapusky's copper whistle. He was planning on sending the dead man a letter when the conditions were right to see what would happen. Of course, the prerequisite for all of this was that he was certain that there wasn't too much danger involved. After instructing Kapusky to fill up the grave again, Klein had a brief exchange with him about the spirit dance and the corresponding mysticism knowledge, enriching his own knowledge. He also asked Kapusky in detail about how he laid the old gentleman's body, facing down, in accordance with his last words. Under certain special circumstances, using spirit dance to replace part of the cumbersome setup for ritualistic magic would be more effective and simple. Seeing that he had achieved his goal, Klein warned Kapusky to stop dabbling with the so-called resurrection rituals. Then, he left the street through the garden and took a long detour via carriage to East Borough. After changing back into his previous clothes, he returned to Minsk Street and entered his bedroom. After a series of actions, he carried the 3 white feathers and Kapusky's copper whistle above the gray fog. Seated in the fool's high-back chair, Klein conjured pen and a paper. He wrote a divination statement he had long thought of, its origins. Then he held the 3 white feathers and leaned back in his chair. As he chanted silently, Klein entered a dreamland. It was a blurry grayish-white all around him. In this world there was rich darkness without any light. Suddenly the darkness was dyed with a crimson shade. A thin, pale hand reached out of the yellowish-brown soil. A figure slowly got up. He didn't lift the stone slab, but he pierced through the soil directly. Under the crimson-red moonlight, the clothes on the figure's back were tattered, and white feathers grew out one after another. The white-haired man tilted his head, revealing the red spots on his face, as well as his blank, emotionless eyes. It began to walk, struggling through the surrounding fences, heading deeper into the darkness until it disappeared far away. The dream shattered and Klein woke up. White feathers sprouted from the back of the corpse. Its state resembles Miss Sharon's, but it's clearly different as well. It gave off a very heavy and corporeal feeling. It seemed to be phasing between a human's body and a spirit's body in a semi-natural and incomplete transformation. An envoy that's connected to the real world and the spirit underworld. Klein tapped the edge of the long table and thought for quite a while. Then, he divined whether there was any danger in using the copper whistle he received from Kapusky at that very moment, and received a positive answer. Furthermore, the spirit pendulum moved with great amplitude and high frequencies. It's a pity that I can't directly use the copper whistle above the gray fog. The messenger wouldn't be able to enter at all. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any danger. After muttering to himself, Klein descended through the gray fog and returned to the real world. Early morning, in the relatively refreshing woods in Empress Borough, the apothecary, with a round face who was in his 30s, appeared in a secluded corner and stored the herbs that he had secretly planted into a leather bag that he carried around with him. After completing the mission for the day, he straightened his back and he began to stretch his body. He mumbled to himself in great satisfaction, "Sure enough, my physical constitution has improved. I'm no longer like what I was before, where I was relatively resistant to poisonous elements. However, why is my sequence 8 beast tamer? What does this have to do with apothecary?" Well, an apothecary tames and uses plants and parts of animals that have lost their lives, while a beast tamer tames and uses living animals. Does it include beyonder creatures? Then, will my sequence 7 be able to tame and use humans? The old geezer didn't even tell me the name of sequence 7, nor did he give me the formula. When I stabilize, I'll have to try contacting him. The apothecary began punching and kicking to get used to his strengthened body. He only stopped when he was utterly exhausted. Whoosh! While panting, he began to consider a serious problem. How should a beast tamer act? Beast tamer, how should it be done? Look for animals and tame them. As the apothecary was mumbling to himself, he suddenly sensed something and looked towards the artificial lake. There was a huge golden retriever running happily. The large golden retriever seemed to notice his gaze as it suddenly turned its head to look at him. As their gazes met in midair, the large golden retriever froze for a moment. Then it nimbly turned around and ran away, disappearing without a trace. In the Hall family's luxurious villa, Susie returned to a piano room and sat beside Audrey's feet, her tongue hanging out as she panted heavily. It waited until the blonde girl finished playing a song before it said in fear, "Audrey, I met a scary guy. His eyes were scary." "Is that so? What did he want to do to you?" Audrey asked, curious and concerned. Susie thought for a moment and said, "I don't know either. In short, he's very dangerous. That was my intuition." "What does he look like?" Audrey considered, letting the guards and attendants warn the man. "I didn't see him clearly. I feel that he is my natural enemy," Susie replied in all seriousness. "Your natural enemy, a dog-type nemesis?" Audrey gave a reserved smile. "Susie, don't go into those woods for now." "Woof, Audrey, were you in a bad mood?" "I could tell from your piano music," Susie asked. Audrey nodded gently and said, "Yea, I just received word from Glaint that Fors and Zio wanted to inform me that this evening's gathering has been cancelled. I was originally planning to exchange some beyonder ingredients for you, and also attempt to come into contact with people from the psychology alchemists," she added silently in her heart. "Why?" Susie asked, puzzled. Audrey thought for a moment before replying. "It's said to be a result of the serial murders." On Saturday morning, Backlund's air was as bad as usual. Klein was trying to make a noodle dish which he loved to eat as a child. For this, he bought higher quality flour, added water and sugar, and mixed it to form a pot of thin paste. Then, he poured oil into the pot and moistened the surface. After the oil heated up, he scooped up some of the flour paste with his soup spoon and poured it to the side of the pot, spreading it thin. Amidst the sizzling sounds, he spread out several flat pieces of bread, and the fragrance of the flour gradually emanated. When he was almost done, he removed the soft flat pieces of bread, one by one, and put them on the plate. Then, he added water and turned the remaining materials into batter. As soon as he returned to the dining room with the flat bread and paste, Klein impatiently tore off a piece and stuffed it into his mouth. The flat piece of bread only had a rich fragrance of wheat and a sweet taste that whetted his appetite. It was simple and plain, but it was exceptionally delicious. "It's the taste from my memories," Klein quickly ate, occasionally drinking a mouthful of the paste. As he was almost done eating and started to slow down, the doorbell suddenly rang. A new commission. Klein took off his napkin, wiped his hands, and got up to go to the door. Before he touched the handle, the image of a visitor appeared in his mind. It was a middle-aged gentleman with white sideburns, a thin face, and an outstanding temperament. It was the private detective, Isengard Stanton, who could get an invitation from the police. "Why is he here?" Klein opened the door in puzzlement and asked with a smile, "Good morning, Mr. Stanton. Is there something?" Isengard took off his half-top hat and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Moriarty. I wish to work with you. I believe you're an excellent detective. After all, you previously managed to lead your investigations all the way to East Balham Dock and the Dock Union all by yourself. Cooperate." Klein didn't hide his surprise. Isengard tapped his black cane and replied in a deep voice, "To find the serial killer behind the recent chain of serial murders. The police has already offered a reward of £2,000. 305. The detective exchanged £2,000. That's enough to drive all the bounty hunters and private detectives in Backland crazy. This isn't like Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, who was out at sea for extended periods of time and had a bunch of subordinates. It's a bounty that can easily be touched if one reaches out. Well, a pirate with combat prowess comparable to a Sequence 5 was worth 10,000 gold pounds, and a Sequence 6 murderer would have to be at the value of 3,000 to 4,000 pounds to be reasonable. Could it be that the Nighthawks and mandated punishers have misjudged the serial killer to be a Sequence 7, rather than a quasi-expert who is about to advance to Sequence 5? It's very possible that the ritual that the Sun mentioned is rather ancient. Perhaps after the cataclysm, it has rarely appeared again, and the few great churches and military don't have any information regarding this. There's an underlying problem. The Church of the Goddess, the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, as well as the Augustus royal family, was said to have risen from the cataclysm. It's reasonable if they aren't aware of the past, but the Church of the Lord of Storms have always insisted that they are one of the oldest. Could it be that their age is referring to a period of time after the devils retreated back into the abyss? After hearing Isengard Stanton's words, the first thing that flashed across Klein's mind was to assess the amount of the bounty, and then he allowed his mind to wander and made many connections. "What's your opinion?" Isengard noticed that Sherlock Moriarty seemed distracted and pressed him. "My opinion?" Klein was momentarily stumped. A normal private detective would have definitely agreed, both because of the bounty and because of the well-known detective in front of him. A friendship with Isengard would provide him with great benefits in the detective circles. The problem, however, was that Klein wasn't a normal private detective. He was worried that he would run into the Nighthawks who were in charge of the investigation. "Although I now have a beard, glasses, and a change in hairstyle, and the few Nighthawks who have seen me only a few times wouldn't recognize me, what if it was Madame Dolly? However, it also isn't right to turn down the request, as that wouldn't make sense. It would appear bizarre and suspicious. Furthermore, I do hope to catch that devil as soon as possible. Otherwise, I don't know how many innocent girls will be killed." Klein hesitated for a few seconds, then he smiled. "I've recently taken on a very troublesome case. I'm afraid I don't have much spare time." Before Isengard Stanton could speak up, he added, "I can participate in the discussion and help to look through the information and analyze the clues, but I don't think I'll make any specific investigations. I'll do a divination later. If there's a problem, I'll also hold back from sharing my opinion and purely be a spectator." As he spoke, Klein quickly formulated a plan. Holding the black cane in his hand, Isengard pondered for a moment and said, "No problem. I've gathered more than a dozen detectives and have enough people to perform the investigation. What I admire the most about you is your excellent reasoning and analytical skills. Without as many resources as me, you actually managed to go all the way to the East Balham Dock and went to the Dock Union. If we do capture the criminal and receive the bounty, I'll distribute the rewards according to everyone's contribution in a reasonable manner. Trust me, I have some credibility in this business. All right, I hope for a pleasant partnership." Klein reached out with his right hand and shook it, feeling the dry warmth of Isengard's palm. It wasn't easy for a middle-aged gentleman in his 40s or 50s to maintain such a warmth in Backlund's late autumn. This added to Klein's suspicions that Isengard was a Beyonder. Likewise, Isengard smiled and nodded. At that moment, Klein realized that he was being somewhat impolite, so he smiled and said, "Sorry, I forgot to invite you in. Let's talk about this over coffee and tea. Thank you for the offer. I've already arranged for the detectives to come to my house at 9 in the morning to discuss the case. My assistant is waiting for them there." Isengard took out a marvel of mechanical beauty, a silver pocket watch with complicated engravings, opened it, and he said, "We need to head over there to meet them. Will that be a problem?" "Not at all. Let me use the bathroom first and have a change of clothes." At this moment, Klein suddenly rediscovered the feeling of being a nighthawk again, striking evil down, maintaining order and protecting the people. In the bathroom, Klein went above the gray fog and received an acceptable answer through divination. He quickly returned to the real world, put on his coat and hat, took his cane, and followed Isengard into a rental carriage where he sat beside him. Isengard looked at him and asked while seemingly in thought, "I'm very curious about how you managed to discover that Cyber's death was related to the dock union at East Balham Docks." "I didn't discover it. It's a misunderstanding." Klein considered the question seriously to fabricate a lie. With a smile on his face, he answered vaguely, "The crux of the investigation was to first determine that Cyber's death was done by a copycat. This point was all thanks reporter Mike Joseph. After confirming this, using the clues about Cyber's route from Golden Rose, together with other clues, I had a matching guess. So I disguised myself as a reporter to perform the investigations." Isengard nodded slightly, and without wasting any more time on the subject, he went on to give a more detailed account of the serial murders than the newspaper had described, especially the latest case. Time flew by as the discussion and exchange progressed. The carriage arrived at a slightly old building in the Hillston borough. The house's lighting wasn't very good. Even though there wasn't much fog in Backlund today, it remained rather gloomy. Isengard Stanton led Klein through the spacious living room and into the activity room where the fireplace had been lit. Klein looked around and saw about 16 detectives who had filled every available seat in the activity room. "Sherlock," a surprised voice sounded. It seemed to be very familiar with Klein. "Who is it?" Klein looked over in surprise and realized that Detective Stewart, who he had just bade farewell yesterday, was actually here. He carefully looked around and recognized Detective Caslana, who had been protecting Adol and her assistant Lydia. What a coincidence! The corners of Klein's mouth curled up into a smile as he approached Stewart. Stewart squeezed to the side, vacating half of his seat, and said with a pat, "Maybe it's not a coincidence. I've read about it in a magazine before. There's a psychological phenomenon called synchronicity. Just thinking about it can make it happen. Haha, that's a joke." At this point, Isengard introduced Klein to the detectives present. "This is Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, an excellent detective." With his endorsement, Caslana and the others looked at Klein with much more trust than before, believing him to be an outstanding private detective. Klein nodded in response, sat down next to Stewart, and casually asked, "Is your commission over?" "Yes, Adol's situation has improved, and something seemed to happen to that bad company of his, and they're unable to threaten him any further, so we lost our jobs." Stewart laughed and said, "I was planning to rest for a few days, but Mr. Stanton summoned me, so I came to take a look. Actually, this is also good, as I really don't like to take on strange, scary cases. I just read through the information and discovered that the police didn't start investigating the case based on the identity of the victim. I don't think the criminal could have figured out with his eyes if the victim was once a street girl. He must have had contact with them. This is such an important clue, but the police actually missed it. God, this is unbelievable. That criminal most likely recognized the victim with the naked eye, Klein muttered to himself. The majority of the private detectives echoed Stewart's doubts. Only Caslana, Isengard, and a few others remained silent. This is a very important direction. Stewart, get a few friends to continue this line of investigation. When the discussion subsided, Isengard calmly gave a comment. In the time that followed, the detectives argued, raised their voice to retort, stood up at times in order to pace around to collect their thoughts. During this whole time, Klein listened without comment. When the exchange was almost over, he suddenly raised his hand and said, "I want information on the unsolved serial murders in the last 20 years spanning across Backland and even the entire kingdom." The room suddenly fell silent for a few seconds, and most of the private detectives were momentarily unable to understand Klein's intentions and thoughts. Isengard put his pipe to his nose, inhaled its scent, and said thoughtfully, "You think that this isn't the murderer's first series of crimes. You suspect him of having committed similar crimes before, even if the modus operandi is different." "It isn't a suspicion, but almost a certainty," Klein replied in his heart. This was his reasoning based on the information provided by the Sun. Since the killer was working hard to advance from Sequence 6 to Sequence 5, what did he do at Sequence 7 as a serial killer? If he hadn't committed similar crimes, it would have been difficult for him to digest the potion. Even with the accumulation of time, where there was a significant chance of losing control when advancing from Sequence 7 to Sequence 6. Furthermore, there was a high risk for Beyonders in the Abyss Pathway to lose control. Hence, Klein decided that regardless of whether the murderer knew the acting method, he must have done serial murders during his time as a Sequence 7 for various reasons. This way, even if the process of digesting the Sequence 7 potion wouldn't take years to complete, together with Sequence 6, 20 years would be quite a reasonable limit. After all, if one was too old, regardless of whether one had digested the potion or not, advancing to the next sequence would have been too dangerous. As the ritual progressed, the person would become increasingly insane, leaving behind obvious clues. At the current stage, the murderer is calm and has the ability to interfere with divination and tracking. There were almost no loopholes, but he might not have been the same during his early days of inexperience. When he first completed a serial murder case, there was a high chance that he wasn't that cautious. This was the follow-up which would provide the best clues. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, but he nodded and replied, "That criminal's modus operandi doesn't make him seem like a rookie. I have reason to believe that he has done such cases before. By combining the past and the present, we're more likely to grasp the crux of the problem." Hearing his answer, the detectives whispered to each other in discussion. After a brief silence from Isengard, he sincerely praised, "A brilliant idea. Thank you for listening to the story on KevinAudio.com." 306 Giant Bishop. In the evening, Klein sat down on a reclining chair in his activity room. Warmed by the fireplace, he picked up the information that Isengard's assistant had just delivered. As soon as his idea received praise from the great detective in the morning, Caslana immediately claimed that she needed the same piece of information. Stewart had murmured that he had believed Klein was an excellent detective, given his calmness and composure when he faced Adol's case, but he hadn't expected him to be that outstanding. At the same time, he told Klein that if he needed help, he could find him. He knew a lot of people in the detective circles in Backland. Isengard Stanton also promised to immediately contact the police and try to provide the corresponding information to the detectives who needed it before nightfall. He truly was very trustworthy. At the next tarot club, I'll have to ask Little Sun through the world about the characteristics of Sequence 6 Devil and what powers the Beyonders of this sequence possess. I didn't plan on involving myself previously, so I had forgotten to gather the corresponding amount of information. However, since I've decided to help, it's best to be prepared. At the very least, I would know what's happening when danger rears its head. Klein thought for a few seconds. Then he lowered his head and, under the light of the gas lamp, began to look through the unsolved serial murders in the last 20 years of the Lone Kingdom. There were fewer than he had expected. There were a total of 4 in Backland, 5 in the other cities, a total of 9 in total. Yeah, although this world doesn't have the concept of DNA yet and lacks many necessary detective skills, with the impetus of the Emperor, there's already a rudimentary form of fingerprint investigations. Furthermore, there's mediumship, divination, dream entry, and other Beyonder methods. The police usually wouldn't seek out Beyonder teams from the 3 major churches for individual murder cases that don't involve the nobles, the rich, or officials. However, a serial killer has very negative repercussions. It easily causes panic, so they'll definitely make the wisest choice this way. Having only a few unsolved serial murders in the past 20 years is reasonable and logical. Klein quickly understood the reason. He gathered his thoughts and began flipping through the cases, one after another. In the absence of sufficient information to perform a divination, he had initially selected 2 serial killings that might be related to the current incident and intended to use them as an initial starting point. One case occurred 4 years ago. There were 5 victims, all single prostitutes with a child. They had been mistreated before they died but lacked any evidence of sexual intercourse. The police in charge of the case at the time thought that the murderer must have known the whores, or else it would have been impossible to precisely select individuals with a child. They had identified the suspects from the people who lived nearby and from the regular customers of several of the whores, but in the end, they failed to find the real murderer. Although the dossier only made a brief note, Klein could clearly tell that they had asked for the help of Beyonders from the 3 major churches. Unfortunately, they were still unable to crack the case. With the Beyonder powers of the Abyss, being able to tell signs that a woman had once been a degenerate doesn't go against the law of mysticism. Likewise for recognizing an individual as a prostitute, but it doesn't make sense that they would know that the woman was single with only 1 child. The police were right. What was the problem? The real murderer was like me, able to resist dreams, divination, mediumship, and evade the investigations from mid-sequence Nighthawk and mandated Punisher Beyonders. It's possible. Although the church doesn't lack knowledge about the serial killer, the murderer might have had some fortuitous encounters. Klein picked out some problems from his own standpoint. I'm analyzing them by being part of their kind. I really didn't fail to live up to the name of Moriarty. He gave a self-deprecating comment and decided that the first target would still be the 4 from Backlund. Yes, I'll get Mr. Stanton to confirm the suspect's current address and condition through the police, and I'll ask Stewart to get others to help. That way, I wouldn't appear directly, so as to avoid encountering any official Beyonders. After the situation has been clarified, I can gather the suspect's belongings and move them above the gray fog to make metaphysical deductions. Klein quickly worked out a plan. The second case had taken place 11 years ago. 4 cases of dismembered corpses had happened in succession. Originally, these cases were considered as isolated cases until the police began having suspicions over the way the bodies were handled. Only then was it confirmed that it was a case of serial murders. The victims were men and women who had worked till late at night before they returned home. They weren't robbed, and there had been no common connection between them. Due to the delay time, which was very valuable when the crime was first committed, the case failed to produce any clues pointing to a suspect. This is a problem caused by mishandling the case. If they had quickly received the help of a spirit medium, The wraith of the deceased might even gather around the murderer, of course. It's also possible that the wraith can be killed by the murderer, just like this case. There's probably only ashes of those victims left. It will be hard to do any investigations through them. Klein rubbed his temples, and when he saw that it was evening, he stopped considering the case and got up from his reclining chair to leave Minsk Street. He had something to do that night. He wanted to go to the area south of the bridge, to the Harvest Church on Rose Street, to find Bishop Otravsky in a bid to obtain the apothecary formula. He had already divined to see if it was dangerous or not. To Klein, having an apothecary as a subordinate was extremely helpful. He could get injured or fall sick. He could encounter enemies who could harm him, and an apothecary who he could find at any moment would be someone he could rely on. After making a detour to East Borough, Klein disguised himself and took the steam metro to cross the Tussock River and arrived at the district south of the bridge. Along the way, the darkness along the metro line and the corresponding gas lamps formed an unforgettable scene. While on the public carriage, Klein came to Rose Street and found the tiny Harvest Church, which was easily recognizable. The golden cathedral had a more striking steeple and a sacred emblem of life engraved on its outer wall. It was a baby surrounded by the symbols of wheat, flowers, and spring water. It stood out from the surrounding buildings. At that moment, the cathedral's lights were dim, and there wasn't a single devotee inside. Klein sneaked in from the side, carefully dabbing his face with paint rather than relying solely on his ability to create illusions. In the hall of the cathedral, rows of pews were arranged neatly. Right at the top, at the front, there was a large sacred emblem of life. Candles were lit on both sides of it. A tall man in his 40s or 50s wearing a brown clergyman's attire sat in the front pew. Just by sitting there, he was like a small mountain, giving off an extremely oppressive feeling. The man wore a bishop's bonnet and his eyebrows were light and thin. There were obvious wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, his cheeks, and the corners of his mouth. He had his eyes closed tightly, his hands clasped as he pressed them to his chin, as if in the most pious of confessions. Suddenly he opened his eyes, revealing a patch of light blueness. "The Mother's Church will not reject anyone. Why didn't you take the main entrance?" The 40 to 50-year-old man didn't raise his head as he spoke in a low and gentle voice. "Are you Bishop Otravsky?" Klein walked out of the shadows. The tall man in the brown bishop's attire replied gently, "I prefer to be called a father, Father Otravsky." "All right, Your Grace." Klein deliberately laughed. "Your name and your height tell me that you're from Fasak. Why do you believe in Mother Earth?" Bishop Otravsky raised his head slightly and stared at the sacred emblem of life ahead of him and said with emotion, "I was born along the coasts of Midseashire in Daw. I was a man who was passionate about combat and killing." "In Daw? He really is from the Fasak Empire." Klein nodded indiscernibly. Midseashire was the natural border between Lone, Intis, and Fasak. The east coast belonged to Lone, most of the west coast belonged to Intis, and to the north were the famous port cities of the Fasak Empire, such as Indaw. In addition, the Midseashire spread to the northeast, penetrating through the Fasak Empire's territory and connecting with the North Sea. There were many islands in that part of the sea that were the habitats for polar bears and sea lions. Hunting polar bears and sea lions were a traditional festival for the citizens of Fasak. Just as his thoughts began to wander a little, Bishop Otravsky continued looking forward and said, "I committed a serious crime and fled to the Sonya Sea, where I became a ruthless pirate. I was lucky enough to meet a missionary of Mother Earth before I fell into the true hell of the soul. After that day, I understood the value of life, understood the charms of all living things, and gained the joy that stems purely from life itself. I swore in front of the Mother Earth's sacred emblem that I would spread her faith in other countries to make up for my bloody past. Thus, here I am. I came here. Amidst his calm and emotional voice, Bishop Otravsky stood up. He was over 2.2 meters tall and his build was sturdy. His robes were tight and he looked like a giant from the legends who reappeared on the northern continent. A real giant is 3 to 5 meters tall with a single vertical eye. The citizens of the Fasek Empire are generally tall. It's no wonder that they've always claimed to be the remnants of giants, believing that they have the blood of giants. Klein had to raise his neck to look at the priest's face. "What are you doing here?" Bishop Otravsky asked with his head lowered. "I heard you have a request and that the reward is the apothecary formula." Klein, who had donned a disguise, went straight to the point. Bishop Otravsky fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "Yes. Although I'm not sure where you learned of this, it's true." "Then what task is it?" Klein asked with a smile. Otravsky sized him up seriously for a while before saying, "I don't think you can fulfill my request. Perhaps I can. I need to know the details before I can make an evaluation." Klein frowned. Otravsky stood there like a giant pillar. After a few seconds he said, "My request is..." At this point he closed his eyes and said, "Kill me. 307 Dawn Paladin kill you." It was the first time Klein had heard of such a request, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond to such a task. He even started to suspect if there was a conspiracy. Bishop Otravsky opened his eyes and looked down at Klein. "Kill the old me." "Father, can you not have such long pauses when you're speaking?" Klein's mouth twitched as he asked in puzzlement. "Even in the legends and myths, no one can return to the past. I'm afraid this task of yours can only be accomplished by the 7 gods." "No, I mean, killing the past me which has never died as it resides in the depths of my heart." Seeing that Klein was still confused, the slightly hunchbacked bishop said, "The former me, who used to love to kill and fight, didn't completely die just because of my contrition. I can clearly sense that he's still living inside my body, always wanting to regain control of everything, and I'm constantly suppressing him, hoping that he will be redeemed through mass, ascetic cultivation and preaching, making him truly believe in the teachings of the Mother Earth and become one with me again. Simply put, the imprints of the past are too deep, and they fiercely conflict with your current life, resulting in a split personality." The pseudo-psychologist and keyboard warrior Klein Moretti made a preliminary judgment and said in deliberation, "It's a psychological problem. I think what you need most is a psychiatrist. I've attempted that before. Perhaps you aren't aware. There is a doctor sequence among the Seer Pathway that the Church of Mother Earth controls, which is also known as healing pastor in ancient times. They've studied my problem and believe it's not as simple as a psychological ailment. It's also mixed with the inclination of losing control. If the past me defeats the present me, I will lose control without a doubt and become a monster," Otravsky said with a sigh. "Then what you need is the Spectator Pathway Sequence 7, Psychiatrist." Klein thought for a moment and said, "Your words make me believe that you've found a way to solve your problem, but you only lack a suitable executor. Am I right?" "Yes, all these years, besides preaching, I've also been searching for people and objects that can help me. In the end, with Mother Earth's blessings, I obtained a very mystical item. It is said to be a relic of an ancient dragon." Seeing that Klein wasn't scared away, Otravsky answered with some hope. "It allows the wielder to enter the deepest part of the target's soul, or in other words, the bottom of the target's dreamland. There, a corresponding scene will be materialized. That way you can see the past me directly and then, through combat, eliminate him. In that special state, once he is truly dead, he will never appear again. As expected of the mysterious world, there's actually such a method to treat someone with split personalities." Klein sighed with emotion and cautiously asked, "What restrictions are there, or what harm will it cause to the holder? Why do you think I'm incapable of completing this task?" Bishop Otravsky looked down at Klein and said, Once you use that mystical item, although the owner will remain conscious, there are many layers to the soul or dreamland. The past me will be able to make full use of this point to deceive you, or conversely, they can even kill you. And after a set period of time, yes, 5 minutes, that mystical item will make you completely lose consciousness, and your mind will never be able to return to your body and become its sacrifice. In this way, you will become a vegetable. In addition, as a result of the scene's materialization, if you're killed in the deepest part of your heart, or to put it in another way, the lowest level of the dreamland, similar side effects will occur. It's equivalent to true death. Believe me, the past me is much stronger than you think. So that's how it is. However, this issue isn't a problem at all for me. I'm someone who can stay awake and rational during spirit channeling and dreams. Even if that mystical item wants to make me lose myself completely, there's no need to worry too much. As long as there's room for struggle, I can take 4 steps counterclockwise and chant my honorable name, and directly head above the gray fog. The problem is, how strong is the past Bishop Otravsky, and what are my chances of defeating him? What restrictions or taboos are there in fighting in a materialized spiritual world? Klein thought for a while and said, "How strong were you, Father Otravsky?" "I don't think I would definitely lose." Bishop Otravsky's eyes turned adrift for a moment. "I was a warrior. I have already reached sequence 6 of my Beyonder pathway, becoming a Dawn Paladin. So he's not a Beyonder of the Planter pathway. He himself said that he had committed a crime and become a pirate before being converted by the Church of Mother Earth sequence 6. Yes, it's not like I can't win. A magician is the kind of Beyonder that's much stronger if they make preparations in advance. Also, due to my uniqueness, the deepest part of my heart, or the lowest level of my dreamland, can be considered as my home ground." Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "Will that mystical item weaken him?" "Yes, but it's still his main region of activity, so the weakening wouldn't be too great. At most, it would be like he had already fought an intense battle." Otravsky recalled his previous attempts. "That just raises my chances." Klein continued, "Is there anything I need to pay attention to in that special environment?" "Just like real combat, effective attacks are always effective. Illusions will remain illusions. But one thing must be noted. He can bring you into a few other levels of the dreamland at any time, creating a situation where it's hard to determine whether it's reality or an illusion." Bishop Otravsky emphasized, "So you have to be at least at sequence 6, or some other special sequence 7 to be able to complete this mission, and the risk is nothing trivial." Heh, if I didn't swear on a holy artifact of Mother Earth that I wouldn't ask the church for help before my missionary succeeds, things wouldn't have been so difficult. So that's how it is. I'm not afraid of a dream. The corner of Klein's mouth curled up. Final question. Are there any points to take note of when fighting a Dawn Paladin? Bishop Otravsky frowned his wrinkled face and said with a sigh, "This is something that requires absolute secrecy for Beyonders. However, as long as you participate in enough battles, others would often be able to conclude certain traits. Besides, the more details you know, the higher the chances of success are, right?" "Yes," Klein answered frankly with a nod. In a reminiscent tone, Bishop Otravsky said, "A Dawn Paladin possesses a power akin to that of a giant, enabling the area within a 40-50 meter radius to be basked in the light of dawn. Such light can not only dispel illusions, but it also has the special ability to exorcise wraiths and specters, and it can even weaken evil spirits. They can conjure dawn armor around their bodies, which would be equivalent to specially forged full-body armor that doesn't weigh anything or inhibit their motion in any way. If destroyed, recovery would require a certain amount of time. He can also conjure different weapons. The strongest weapon would be a two-handed rapier. It's often called the Sword of Dawn. It's sharp, solid, and each strike has a purification effect. Apart from that, Dawn paladins have a type of beyonder power to create a hurricane of light. It can directly destroy a person's body, eliminate wraiths, and damage evil spirits. There aren't a lot of beyonder powers, but they are my natural enemy. They have high offensive strength and defense, and they're not afraid of illusions. The only good news is that, other than for facing wraiths and specters, the mysteriousness of a Dawn Paladin is very low. Klein listened as he simulated a combat situation in his mind, searching for the most reliable way to deal with a Dawn Paladin. The level of mysteriousness he was referring to implied strangeness, unpredictability, unfathomability, and incomprehensibility. Bishop Otravsky looked at him quietly. He didn't press him or drive him away. After gradually formulating a plan, Klein raised his head, looked over, and said, "Perhaps I can give it a try, but I will need to leave for a few minutes to confirm that you're not lying." Bishop Otravsky replied with a slightly stunned voice, "No problem. However, I must remind you once again, although I don't know where your confidence stems from, do not belittle the past me. He's extremely skilled in combat. I wouldn't joke with my life." Klein pressed his hand to his chest, bowed, and stepped out of the Harvest Church. He found a secluded spot and quickly went above the gray fog to make a divination. After obtaining an answer that there was a certain danger but at tolerable levels, he immediately returned to the real world. From the beginning to the end, it only took him about 10 to 20 seconds above the gray fog. Following that, Klein returned to the Harvest Church and said to Bishop Otravsky, who stood in his original spot, "I'll take this commission." Bishop Otravsky stared at him intently before slowly saying, "If you succeed, not only will I give you the apothecary formula, but I will also gift you a mystical item without much of a negative side effect." Klein was taken aback at first before he sincerely praised, "Father, you truly are a generous person." Bishop Otravsky didn't say another word. He took a strange candle from a concealed pocket in his brown clergyman's tunic. The outer layer of the short candle seemed to be wrapped in a layer of human skin, but there were also several bumps on it. Its wick was about the length of a finger segment and was entirely black in color. It was covered in tiny, densely packed scale-like patterns. "Ignite it with your spirituality." Otravsky handed the tiny, strange candle to Klein. Instead of following his instructions, Klein took out a matchbox, took out a few of them and put them in his trouser pocket. He lit and blew out a few other matchsticks before throwing them at various corners of the cathedral. Then, he adjusted the positions of the paper figurines, paper notes, long strips of paper, Azic's copper whistle, and various charms. This was in preparation for the worst-case scenario that he could imagine. After all of this was done, Klein snapped his fingers, causing a blue-colored flame of spirituality to appear. Sizzle! He held the flame close to the top of the tiny candle and watched the black wick light up. Nothing seemed to change, but Klein was acutely aware that he had entered the world of the mind. Directly in front of him, he saw Bishop Otravsky still standing in his original spot. His sturdy body, which was more than 2.2 meters tall, gave off a sense of oppression. The repentant bishop looked down at him, his facial muscles contorting. Following that, his expression became abnormally ferocious. Soon after, Klein discovered that the surrounding light and shadows were rapidly transforming, and it felt like he was experiencing a real, intense battle. At the end of the battle, Bishop Otravsky fell heavily to the ground. His breathless body had blood flowing profusely. Klein's mouth twitched as he saw the scene before him with a clear mind. He silently evaluated, "What a professional performance. But I know that this is a dream within a dream." 308 A prepared magician. When Klein looked down again, he could no longer see the strange candle wrapped in human skin. Instead, a faint, slightly sweet scent kept lingering around his nose. Ignoring the Bishop Otravsky's body that was lying down in a pool of his own blood, he took out his matchbox and lit one match. The blood on the ground disappeared as soon as the spark was produced, and the messy church hall became tidy once again. The gargantuan Otravsky slowly got up, looked down at Klein, and said with a twisted face, "It actually didn't have any effect. It's no wonder that you dared to accept this task. However, this is your misfortune. I didn't actually want to kill you." As he spoke, the candlelight on both sides of the cathedral began to flicker visibly. The entire hall suddenly brightened, but it was mild and not blinding. It was as if the morning sun had just come in. The invisible spirit quickly vanished, and Klein, without a word, threw the match, flexed his cheeks, and simulated a sound. Bang! An invisible air bullet shot out and struck Bishop Otravsky heavily in the chest, producing a resounding sound. However, the giant bishop had at some point equipped a set of silver armor that covered his entire body. It included gauntlets, breastplates, and a helmet. At that moment, a spider-web-like crack appeared on the silver metal at his chest, but it didn't completely shatter. It even began to slowly recover. Bang! Bang! Klein produced a series of sounds, creating 2 air bullets that followed one after the other, sending them towards the enemy's chest in a bid to completely destroy the enemy's defenses with a continuous barrage of attacks. However, he saw that in Bishop Otravsky's hand was a heavy, wide rapier, looking as if it was condensed from light. Using it, he deftly blocked the 2 air bullets, producing 2 sounds which were almost impossible to distinguish. Creak! Otravsky took 1 step forward, and the cathedral seemed to shake. At the same time, his 2-handed rapier swept down at Klein in a gesture that looked as if it was going to shatter the building. Before the sword arrived, the wind that it carried with it almost caused Klein to lose his balance. Such terrifying power! As this thought flashed through his mind, Klein deftly jumped to the side and bent over, ready to roll on the spot. Bang! The 2-handed rapier in Otravsky's hand smashed into the ground, shattering the stone slabs and causing cracks to spread rapidly in all directions. Screech! He dragged the rapier along the ground as he switched from a vertical slash to a horizontal sweep, causing sparks to fly. This move was meant for opponents who loved to roll. Just as Klein was about to hit the ground, the image of himself being struck by the 2-handed rapier appeared in his mind. He quickly swung his arms and reached out with his palms. He lightly pressed and once again leaped into the air. Whoosh! The resulting wind blew across the dust on the ground, and the terrifying rapier flattened the nearby pews. However, before Klein could counterattack, the giant bishop chained his attack without any pause. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes, 5 strikes, 6 strikes, 7 strikes. Otravsky seemed to possess extremely robust stamina. His unceasing, storm-like attacks lasted for dozens of seconds. He used the simplest of sword techniques, slashing vertically, slashing diagonally, sweeping horizontally, thrusting forward and bashing forward to demonstrate what was the most effective and reasonable way to deal the most damage. And the range of the 2-handed rapier reached a terrifying extent. Klein jumped, rolled, and ran. He didn't have the opportunity to use his powers and appeared rather pathetic. If it wasn't for the matches that he thrown ahead of time in different corners of the cathedral, and how the candle on both sides of the altar had yet to be extinguished, allowing him to flash, he probably would have been slain by his enemy. As expected of a Beyonder job that's adept at combat, no mistakes, no weaknesses, Klein didn't panic because of this. Amidst his rolling and dodging, he constantly looked for any flaws that the enemy had, waiting for his attacks to reach a moderate stage. Finally, he discovered a problem with Otravsky's sword techniques. The 2-handed rapier was too long and too large, and it had an obvious flaw in close combat. With this thought flashing in his mind, Klein took advantage of the rapier's vertical slash to roll forward to the left, and then, with a push of his palm, he quickly rolled to the spot between Otravsky's legs. As a half-giant, who was over 2.2 meters tall, Utravsky would have his legs spread apart from simply standing. His silver crotch was clearly visible. As soon as he rolled over, Klein's left hand reached into his pocket, pulled out a long piece of paper, and turned it into a sharp and hard cane. He then inserted it into the gap at the side of the enemy's crotch, stabbing into the body of the giant bishop. This would be a fatal blow. However, at this moment his heart trembled. The image of a rapier stabbing down as boundless light, forming a terrifying storm, engulfed his entire body appeared in his mind. A trap. Utravsky's trap. Klein didn't hesitate. He pressed his right hand down, jumped forward through the gap between the legs of the giant bishop's legs, and arrived behind him. By the time he finished this set of motions, Utravsky was holding the hilt of his sword with both hands, bending his waist and lifting his sword up to thrust straight down into the stone slab in front of him. With a cracking sound, rays of light surged out of the sword's body like the first rays of dawn. They turned into a hurricane and swept across the surroundings. Without a sound, the stone slab disappeared from where Klein had been, and the earth beneath it became nearly 10 centimeters thinner. The silver armor on his legs and crotch was also damaged, shattering inch by inch and revealing his skin. His trap was to sustain damage in exchange for the death of his enemy. At this moment, Klein, who had leaped behind Bishop Utravsky, finally found an opportunity to counterattack. He twisted his body midair, puffed out his cheeks, and simulated gunshot sounds at the back of his enemy's head. Bang! Bang! 2 air bullets hit the back of Utravsky's head in quick succession, shattering the silver metal in that area and then splitting it into pieces, exposing a completely unprotected area. Klein was about to give him a fatal blow when Utravsky suddenly straightened up, twisted his waist, and violently swept the two-handed rapier backward. The speed was so fast and the attack was so ferocious that Klein seemed unable to dodge it. However, he pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket and placed it in front of his body. Clang! The collision between the sword and the piece of paper produced the sound of metal being struck. The crisp sound of metal striking metal filled the entire cathedral. Klein was sent flying like a tennis ball. The paper in his hand was torn apart, leaving behind only a tiny piece in between his fingers. In midair, he was immediately faced with the violent and swift pursuit of Utravsky. The situation was precarious. However, he didn't panic in the slightest and only shook his wrist. The tiny piece of paper flew up, and a spark rapidly expanded, completely enveloping Klein. Hum! The rapier sliced through the ball of fire, but it didn't cause any damage, only creating a small spark. At the candle on the right side of the cathedral, a faint yellow flame spread out, forming a figure whose face was painted with oil paint. Klein reappeared and pulled out another long strip of paper from his pocket. Pa! With a flick of his wrist, the paper turned into a sturdy whip. The surface of the whip was even burning with scarlet flames. Pa! 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 Klein lashed out at the giant bishop from a distance. However, his weapon quickly disintegrated under the attacks of the two-handed rapier. And that was precisely Klein's goal. Pa! 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 With a snap of his fingers, he sent streaks of fire flaring up from the ground, blocking Utravsky and burning his unprotected legs. The Dawn armor's recovery was rather slow. As the tongues of fire leaped upwards, his legs were charred black and a crimson color was seeping up his legs. However, this didn't affect the giant bishop's agility. He let out a low growl, and like a steam train that had finally accelerated to its highest speed, he charged through the flames and appeared in front of Klein. This speed was unbelievably fast. Soon after, the two-handed rapier in Utravsky's hands cracked, turning into spots of light that swept forth in all directions. Almost instantly, Klein fell into a situation of certain death. The matches he kept on him were ignited, and an intense flame engulfed him. However, this wasn't as fast as the hurricane of light. Just as the scarlet-red flame appeared, it was immediately engulfed. Klein's body was torn asunder as it was reduced to shreds, but they ended up losing their thickness and turned into bits of paper. Behind Otravsky, a column of scarlet-red flames flared, and Klein stepped out. He took out a matchbox from his other pocket and threw it at the enemy, as if to ignite all the remaining matches in one go, and through the restraints of the small space, create a reliable explosion. The matchbox was aimed at Otravsky's lower body, which no longer had any protection. Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. At the same time, Bishop Otravsky jumped up on his back, bent his knees, and withdrew his legs. Pa, accompanied by the snap of his fingers, was an unaffected matchbox, but a loud bang. It was an air bullet that accurately tore open the back of Bishop Otravsky's head, which lacked any protection. It was a lethal weapon that had been prepared in advance. His skull split open and blood and white bits spurted out. With great difficulty, Otravsky turned his head around and said in a daze, "You." The matchbox, that was riddled with holes caused by the hurricane of light, fell to the ground. However, it remained unignited. Klein laughed and replied, "I've never said that snapping my fingers could only be used to control flames and not shoot out air bullets. Look, pa, pa, pa." He snapped his fingers repeatedly, allowing one air bullet after another to hit Otravsky in the head, shattering his helmet and cracking his head. Bam! Otravsky stopped breathing and fell heavily to the ground, shaking the cathedral hall slightly. "Pa!" Klein turned and snapped his fingers again. The box of matches on the ground exploded, transforming into a scarlet flame that buried Otravsky's gigantic body. Klein didn't attempt to sense the existence of the candle, but instead, he relied on his own clarity of mind to force himself out of the lowest level of his mind. Behind him, the corpse was wrapped in scarlet flames as the world around him disintegrated bit by bit. 309, choosing 1 out of 2, the illusory feeling passed, and Klein saw the strange candle in his hand again, along with its black wick and palish white flame. The damage of the dawn pallid in the shattered ground, broken pews, and the sliced candles had been restored to their pre-battle state. It was hard to tell where they had been damaged. At some point, Bishop Otravsky, who had been standing opposite him, had taken a seat in the front pew, his back bent forward and his head buried in his hands. His hands were pressed to his temples. Drip, drip, sweat trickled down his face and spread out from his feet. The ground was already completely wet. When he sensed that the strange candle had been extinguished by Klein, he shuddered and raised his head to meet Klein's eyes. His slightly turbid eyes were filled with tears, and his wrinkled face was streaked with tears. However, his eyes were filled with emotion, joy, and clarity. If it was said that this giant bishop previously appeared tall and heavy, then all that was left of him now was the heaviness of his body, but without the heaviness of his spirit. At this moment, Klein felt like he was looking at a newborn baby. Those tears were proof of new life. The corners of Otravsky's mouth curled up slightly as he smiled kindly. "You're much better than I expected." "No, this is because I gained sufficient understanding in advance and made the appropriate preparations. As for the past you, not only were you unsure of your opponent's strengths, you were also greatly weakened. If I were to fight against you in the real world, I would be considering how to escape," Klein calmly replied. "A prepared magician and an unprepared magician are very different concepts," he added silently in his heart. Bishop Otravsky didn't dwell on this problem. Brimming with relief from head to toe, he said, "Thank you, my friend. According to our agreement, I'll give you the apothecary formula. I'll also give you an additional mystical item." As he spoke, from his pocket he took out what looked like a combination of a needle, a tube, and a container. "You have 2 choices. This is one of the 2 choices you have. When I got it, I didn't know its name, and I never thought about naming it either. You're able to use it to draw out a tube of blood, your own blood. At a critical moment, you can transfuse it back into you. That way, your fatigue will disappear." Your ailments and injuries will be alleviated, and your strength, speed, balance, and other attributes will all be greatly enhanced. Bishop Otravsky pointed to the object in his hand. What about its limitations and latent dangers? Klein asked rationally. Otravsky looked at the mysterious patterns on the needle and tube and explained in detail. After drawing out a tube of blood, you'll be weakened for a full 12 hours, and during those 12 hours, transfusing the blood back into you wouldn't have any effect. Of course, the specific time limit isn't that precise. It increases or decreases according to your body's condition. In addition, it's best not to use it too often, not more than once a week. Otherwise, not only will the transfusion bring you power, but it will also temporarily make you lose your rationality, and the short period when you have your blood drawn and turn weak will become your characteristic. In addition to these, it also has a problem. If you carry it around for more than half an hour, you'll become a little neurotic. Fortunately, Bishop Otravsky didn't previously draw his blood. Otherwise, if the past him can transfuse his blood, my chances of winning would have been very, very low. This was the first thought that flashed through Klein's mind. He frowned and was rather worried about the negative effects of the mystical item. Regardless of whether it was a temporary loss of rationality, a 12-hour period of weakness, or a change in his mental state, these were all hidden dangers that didn't seem too problematic. But after seeing rampagers and hearing the ravings of an evil god, Klein believed that a Beyonder's mental state was very important. If one's mental state remained at a nadir for an extended period of time, or if there were frequent anomalies, it would easily cause the phenomenon of losing control to happen. This was the same even if a Beyonder had grasped the acting method. "What's the second choice?" Klein said after 2 seconds of silence. Bishop Otravsky took out a simple brass key from his other pocket and smiled. "This is called a master key. It can help you open any lock which doesn't contain mystical powers, as well as a small number of locks that are augmented with Beyonder effects. And in a place without any locks or doors, it can open a passageway that doesn't belong to reality. Heh heh. The premise is that there are no restrictions by Beyonder powers and the barriers aren't too thick. Its spirituality is completely restrained. When it's not being used, Beyonders cannot see any difference between it and a normal key." Otravsky stood up again, leaving Klein no choice but to look up. The giant bishop increased his pace and came to the wall at the side of the cathedral hall and pressed the master key against the brick. He twisted gently, and his entire body seemed to sink into water as ripples were produced. He went through the wall and arrived outside. In the same way, Bishop Otravsky returned to the cathedral hall and entered Klein's line of sight again. "Have you decided on the mystical item?" the tall priest asked with his head lowered. "What are the latent dangers of the master key?" Klein asked after some deliberation. Bishop Otravsky smiled warmly and said, "The person carrying it will occasionally get lost. According to what someone told me, one gets lost at random." "Lost? I'm a seer with spiritual intuition." Klein mumbled, and his mind gradually came to a decision. After a few seconds he said, "I want the master key." He didn't want his mental state to be affected, and he didn't want to accumulate the risk of losing control. "What a pity. What I want the most is that weird candle. It's akin to the deepest part of a soul, the lowest level of a dreamland. That's equivalent to my home ground," he sighed in his heart. "All right." Bishop Otravsky handed the simple brass key to Klein and took back the strange candle wrapped in human skin. While Klein was examining the mystical item, Otravsky pointed at the back and said, "The apothecary formula is in that room. I'll go get it. Wait here for a while." Klein nodded in response. Taking advantage of the moment when Bishop Otravsky's figure disappeared from the hall, he took out a penny and divined if he had been lying about the master key. After receiving an acceptable answer, he walked to the wall in front of him where a row of candles were placed and pressed the ancient brass key against the hard wall. As he injected spirituality and turned the key, Klein's vision suddenly blurred and then became clear. At that moment, there were no longer burning candles filling his vision, nor were there neat pews and straight walls. There were only withered grass and muddy land strewn with a bit of garbage. To the side it led out to where a gas street lamp stood. I really came out. Klein smiled, nodded, turned, and once again using the master key to successfully return to the cathedral's hall. After more than 10 seconds of waiting, Otravsky walked in with heavy footsteps, a roll of yellowish-brown goatskin parchment in hand. "You can get an appraisal for this. If there's a problem, you can always find me at the Harvest Church." The giant bishop handed the apothecary formula to Klein. Main ingredients: horn of an adult flying unicorn, 3 grams of a royal jellyfish's venom crystal. Klein swept his gaze, smiled, and replied, "I will confirm its authenticity. For example, divine it above the gray fog," he added inwardly. Bishop Otravsky nodded slightly, and without another word he turned around and walked to the Mother Earth's sacred emblem of life. He spread his arms wide and chanted in a low voice, "Thank you, source of life. Praise you, mother of all things." Klein put away the master key and the apothecary formula. After Otravsky stopped, he said half-jokingly, "Could it be that my visit was arranged by Mother Earth? Why else would you be thanking her for? The false believer of the Evernight goddess," Klein chuckled inwardly. "Yes, everything is arranged by Mother Earth. Otherwise, my request for help wouldn't have reached your ears. I wouldn't be here in Backland either. Nor would I have obtained this mental terror candle," Backland Otravsky said with a gentle smile without any signs of anger. Complete and self-consistent believer logic, but Klein suddenly felt that it was impossible to communicate with him. He pressed his hand to his chest, bowed, and said, "Thank you for your generosity. I should leave now." He straightened his body and quickly retreated. He then rapidly disappeared from the main hall of the cathedral and from Rose Street. 10 minutes later, he saw the golden facade of the Harvest Church from another direction, and he couldn't help but twitch his mouth. "I can't go back without divination," he silently muttered to himself. He really wanted to stubbornly rely on his own ability to overcome the fact that he was lost. But his hand, which was faster than his voice, had broken the branches of a tree and made a makeshift dowsing rod. Dowsing rod seeking could be used to seek people, as well as items and directions. This time, Klein was able to return home without incident, and he even confirmed the authenticity of the formula and the latent dangers of the master key. The next morning was a Sunday morning. After waking up, Klein ate breakfast, took out a pen and paper, and wrote a letter to Isengard Stanton, asking him to seek help from the police to confirm the current status of the few suspects for the serial murder case from 4 years ago. Back then, the targets were single prostitutes with a child. After folding the letter and stuffing it in an envelope, Klein put on a black stamp which was 1 penny in denomination. Putting on his clothes, he took his hat and cane, and he walked out of his house to post the letter at the mailbox at the end of the street. Then, he saw Mrs. Stellan Sammer and her husband, Mr. Luke, dressed to the nines. A rental carriage was stopped by their door. "Good morning." "Why are you attending a banquet so early in the morning?" Klein asked with some surprise. Luke chuckled and said, "It's not really a banquet, it's more like us helping out." Mrs. Stellan raised her chin slightly and added, "Mary has successfully entered the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. There will be a grand ball tonight, and we have to help out in advance." "Mrs. Mary's wish has been fulfilled." "Impressive." Klein sighed and said with a smile, "Please pass on my congratulations to Mrs. Mary for me." Luke Sammer nodded and said, "You haven't read this morning's paper, have you? All the members of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council have been published. The chairman of the council is Sir Dare Shaw and the first secretary is Mr. Hibbert Hall." 310 National Atmospheric Pollution Council Sir Dare Shaw, Mr. Hibbert Hall. Who are they? I don't know them at all. Acting as though he had no doubts, Klein said half-jokingly, let's hope that they can bring blue skies and sunshine to Backlund. Yes, although burning in your own fireplace is everyone's freedom and is a right granted by the law, blue skies and sunshine are more desirable things. Luke Sammer, a member of the Soot Reduction Association, sighed with emotion and pointed to the hired carriage. We should go. Mary urgently needs some help. Stellan Sammer added, feigning a level of restraint. There might be members of Parliament coming to the banquet from the Backlund district or from the kingdom. I can imagine the grandeur of this banquet. Klein flattered politely and watched the Sammers board the carriage and leave. As he turned to head for the post office at the end of the street, a postman in a dark green uniform arrived in a carriage and delivered a letter to his letterbox. A letter for me. Klein pulled out a bunch of keys and casually chose the one that was simple and had a brass color. Catcha. The master key easily opened the letterbox. I just need to have this key on me in the future. Klein mumbled as he took out the newspapers he had subscribed to and the letter. The letter was from Isengard Stanton. He had also looked through the old and unresolved serial murders yesterday and had picked out the most suspicious ones. And after obtaining a preliminary confirmation from the police department about the present circumstances of the suspects, he had written to Klein, Kaslana, and the other private detectives that were interested in this angle to share his findings. It included the two cases that Klein had focused on. Great detective minds think alike. The letter I wrote just now was for nothing, Klein joked before returning to the living room. According to Isengard, the random murder cases of people who returned late had resulted in a large number of suspects, but the suspect had never been narrowed down. After so many years, it was very difficult, almost hopeless, to try to find a new clue. One of the four suspects in the other case was a teenager whose mother was also a victim, a prostitute and single mother who had him as her only child. He had been abused by his mother, had been the police's first suspect, but less than half a year after that case, he had been seriously injured in a gang firefight in East Borough and died in a surgical room at a charity hospital. His body was cremated with people bearing witness before being buried in the cemetery. As such, it was impossible for him to be connected to the current serial killer. If he hadn't been cremated, I definitely would have dug up the grave to verify it. Klein, who had once come back from the dead, seriously considered the possibility of the other party coming back from the dead. Of the remaining three suspects, one had moved several times in the past few years. The police had lost track of his situation and needed more time to find him. One had gone through bankruptcy and moved to East Borough from North Borough, while the other was still running a grocery store on the same street. Klein took out a fresh sheet of paper, described the situation, and then asked the recipient to observe the two suspects with specific addresses in secret. He emphasized, the killers of serial murders are all cruel, brutal, and very aggressive. Please be careful not to get too close to them. Act as if you're just an ordinary neighbor observing them. The information I need pertains to their recent mental state, such as whether they are irritable, whether they like to shut themselves in their rooms, rarely communicate with others, and whether they have beaten others up. This was also the information he got from the son. After each kill, the devil would eat the victim's organs according to the ritual and stay in a bloodthirsty, manic state until a new victim appeared. After emphasizing the need to take note of the investigator's safety, Klein folded the letter, stuffed it into a new envelope, and affixed a black stamp to the surface. Then he wrote down the name of the recipient, Detective Stewart. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall, Susie was lying in the corner of the study, looking around as if bored. With a bulging stomach, Count Hall took a puff with his pipe and said to his eldest son, "Do you know why I insisted on having you be on the National Atmospheric Pollution Council?" Hibbert Hall replied thoughtfully, "You wish to influence the formulation of the relevant laws and policies." "No. Although I'm the second largest shareholder of the Constant Coal and Steel Consortium, I don't really care about this problem. I've been urging them to make adjustments accordingly. I have no doubt that fixing atmospheric pollution is a future trend. Hibbert, although our family has fixed seats in the House of Lords, and you will also become a member of Parliament of the House of Lords in time, so why do some nobles have more influence than others when they are all members of Parliament of the House of Lords, notwithstanding the Speaker and other people with special statuses?" Hibbert thought for a moment before saying, "The title of nobility, wealth, commercial status, as well as the relationship between the government and the army. That is only a part of it. In addition to one's own ability to handle matters, people will always rely on those with rich experience, and those who have participated in many similar matters. In the future, if you wish to have any achievement in politics, in addition to inheriting a seat, you will also need to try your best at participating in various matters and display the corresponding capabilities. Gradually, your activity will catch the eye of the various members of Parliament. They will slowly find you trustworthy, and that will be the source of your influence. Look at the current situation of the nobles in the Intes Republic, Hibbert. You should understand that with the passage of time and the development of society, the obvious privileges will be weakened, and one's title will become less and less important. It's just a title of honor, and the position and influence of the business world is what you should pay attention to," Count Hall explained in detail. "What if you encounter something you aren't good at?" Hibbert muttered to himself. "Then pretend that you can handle it. Don't worry about wasting money, form professional teams, listen to their opinions and make decisions. Everyone has a lot of areas that they aren't good at, and only money is multifaceted." Count Hall gave words of advice. Hibbert replied in enlightenment, "I see, father." At this moment Susie, who was by the side, yawned in boredom. When it was all over, she slipped into Audrey's art studio, repeated everything she had heard, and finally muttered, "I have no idea what they were talking about." Audrey listened to her thoughtfully, then she said with a faint smile, "They were discussing a good thing that involves reducing the pungent smell you smell." "Is that so?" Susie asked without fully comprehending it. Audrey didn't answer and thought of something else. She had intended to quietly draw attention to the bad conditions of East Borough, the factory area and the dock area, but in the last two social gatherings, she had found herself unable to find an opportunity. Those nobles, those members of Parliament and senior civil servants would never even talk about such matters. There was no way to steer them towards that topic even if she wanted to. On Monday afternoon, Klein returned to 15 Minsk Street from the Kellogg Club. As Stewart had yet to provide any results from his preliminary investigation, and since he was temporarily unable to find a suitable candidate to become an apothecary, Klein had nothing to do yesterday and today. Therefore, he simply went to the Kellogg Club to practice his shooting, read, and get some free food. In the process, he got to know many other members of the club. This is the lifeblood for future business opportunities. Klein sighed with emotion, took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. He went about his preparations, step by step, first conjuring the fake world, familiarizing himself with the control of the all-black eye, and then sent a message to the sun that the tarot gathering was about to begin. After all of this was done, Klein waited for 3 o'clock to arrive. Then he reached out to touch the corresponding crimson stars and established a firm connection. The magician had her own illusory